No, no. Oh, okay.
All right, let's get started. Do you want to make opening statements, or do you want us to start with questions? What's your preference? Anyone?
Whatever you guys want from us.
Okay.
Just get to the questions.
Just want to go to questions? All
You
right.
can use your microphone.
Oh, yeah, let's turn on the mics.
And for the record, my opening statement is my client's not helping. For the record.
All right. Yeah, just make sure you turn on your microphone for the electronic media. So the floor is open.
All right, we're done.
What are you all committed to working on together? Co-caucuses.
Well, I think as far as House Republicans' perspective and some issues, I think we're going to find some similarities. And in fact, I shouldn't say this in front of all my colleagues, but I was at an event with Senator Dossler the other day, and we both were talking about very similar issues. I told Senator Dossler, I said, you're going to kill my reputation if you and I are talking about the same issues, but I think you're going to hear our caucus talking a lot about it, and I think it could be definitely a bipartisan support. Workforce obviously is going to be an issue that's kind of a global topic, I think, this legislative session. And then how do you address that? I think there's things, broadband, housing, childcare. We're going to spend a lot of time within our caucus. We already have and will continue to do, talking about childcare as an issue. So I think some of those, I've already heard from some of my friends on the other side talking about some very similar issues, add things back home. So I think that we'll be able to find some similarities. Now how we get to solutions, that's obviously how we'll work through that. But I think there's some opportunities to work on some important issues to Iowans together.
If I could just chime in from the House side as well. I mean, we've talked a little bit, Speaker Grassley and I, before the session, but there's a couple of things. I think with child care, Democrats would like to see something moved with child care, and that is a workforce issue which we see on. Job training absolutely is a bipartisan issue. I think from our perspective, from the Democratic perspective, we want to see things that are going to provide access and opportunities for working Iowans to better their station in life, whether that's gain job skills that are going to let them command a higher wage and increase their household incomes. Those types of things I think should and will find bipartisan support. Some other things though, I think we all need to acknowledge that we have a healthcare crisis in Iowa. And speaking for the Democrats, we're here to solve this issue. We're here to make sure that all Iowans have access to affordable health care across the state. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for rural districts like mine. And it's going to require a bipartisan solution. So I think in dealing with health care particularly, there needs to be bipartisan working.
And from our standpoint, I'd echo a lot of what's been said. We need to be more competitive as a state. That's not a partisan issue. That's an issue of reality. We're not very competitive when it comes to business tax climate, for example. We still rank in the 40s even after we passed our income tax reform bill a couple of years ago. So we need to continue to strive to do better. Workforce is an issue that's not a partisan issue. That's a challenge for us as a state. We need to find ways to help train people in the state to upskill. We need to find ways to get more people in the state to work in our workforce, and we need to find more ways to bring people to our state too. And some of the other issues that have been mentioned are a part of that, like childcare. The childcare cliff is a big detriment to some people who are trying to work themselves out of poverty, or work their way into a 40-hour-a-week job, or work their way into a promotion. Right now, if you're at 144% of the federal poverty level, you get your child care benefits, and if you're at 145%, they're completely cut off. And that does not incent anyone to work harder or take a promotion. We ought to find a way, if we can, to gradually reduce child care benefits as people's incomes increase, so that they're not automatically cut off if they want to work more, take another job, or accept a promotion.
Well, I'm glad to see childcare making it to the agenda of both parties, and I'm hopeful that we can work together on that. The last time we saw advancements in childcare, Governor Branstad vetoed the additional funding. So I'm hopeful with Governor Reynolds calling attention to this issue that we may be able to make some progress on childcare. I'm also hopeful that we won't see any legislation come out of the Iowa legislature that gives our state a black eye and puts us on travel ban lists. We need to be a state that is a welcoming place to live and work. We need to recognize that we have businesses that are conducting international business, and that we need to make sure that we are a state that is seen as a welcoming state that advances human and civil rights instead of what's the word I'm looking for? Taking us backwards. I'm also hopeful that we can make progress in protecting our children. For the last several years, I worked on legislation to try to improve our statute of limitations laws. In Iowa, we're ranked dead last in the country in our statute of limitations laws, making our place a less safe place for children to live. We're seeing many of the infrastructure problems begin to take shape with Medicaid privatization, and I'm hopeful that Senate Democrats and Republicans can come together on fixing a system that has been injected with corporate greed. I am glad to see the governor finally taking some action by withholding money to these out-of-state corporations that are not paying our providers or providing Iowans with the health care they deserve. We have seen 35 labor and delivery departments in communities across our state shut down, just 10 most recently, and we believe that we may see another 10 labor and delivery departments shut down in the near-term future. Our state is becoming a much less safe place for parents to be, to deliver their babies in the communities where they live. And this issue must be addressed. In the past 3 years alone, we've seen maternal mortality more than double, and that's shameful. And Democrats will be introducing legislation to address this issue, because we can no longer sit back and let our maternal health care system hemorrhage.
Senator Petersen, when the governor was here, she indicated that she might be offering some legislative fixes or maybe some rule changes to deal with the issue of providers not being paid on time by the MCOs. Is there specific legislation that Democrats want to see? And then I'd just like to ask the Republicans as well if there is specific legislation that you're hearing would make a difference in this issue.
Democrats have tried to propose a number of changes to Medicaid to make sure that providers are paid on time. As you remember from last year, we were shut out of bringing those initiatives forward with the double-barrel amendment that Senator Schneider allowed to occur on the HHS budget bill. And so we're hopeful that now that the governor is recognizing that these problems are significant, that we'll be able to have a bipartisan dialogue on the Senate floor to address the issues.
Chime in on that too, just for, in my district, this is a huge problem. It's put my hospital in Floyd County at risk. I mean, they've had a huge shortfall year to year since privatization. The maternity ward in the New Hampton hospital is ceasing operations for its maternity services. So I mean, this issue is causing a cash flow problem for hospitals and providers across the state. I'd be interested to see what the governor's proposing in terms of administrative rules or legislation. But when I look at this, I think really there's an issue here with perhaps the contract and just holding the MCOs accountable to make sure that they're meeting their requirements to make the reimbursements to providers. I mean, I think every member of the legislature got a letter this past year from a nursing home that runs a number of facilities across the state that was months behind in payments. And they have, therefore, trouble making payroll, meeting their expenses, and maintaining and keeping their services in place in the community. And so we've got to address this. I don't think this is something that is going to require us to climb a mountaintop to figure out how to how to timely provide payment to medical providers across the state. But if there's not a will to address it, it's not going to get fixed. And I'm happy to hear that the governor is wanting to do something. We're there hand in hand to help see that happen.
And Senator Schneider, you had mentioned it, but Speaker Grassley, if you would like to weigh in.
Well, I don't want to jump in.
No, go ahead.
Well, when you go last, you got all these things you want to say that you get to hear. But a couple things as far as House Republicans look forward to working with the governor. I think we've already seen with the actions that have been taken with withholding the payments that has shown a willingness to try to do this. I've been very impressed with meetings with the new director, Director Garcia, and I think obviously she'll be working with the governor on strategies that try to address some of the issues that have been discussed here. One thing that I remind everyone is last year in the House we began the initiative of putting an extra, I think it was around $2 million into our critical access hospitals. There's 82 across the state. Representative Pritchard touched on some of the difficulties that they're facing, and we look forward to continuing to support our critical access hospitals. When it comes to labor and delivery, I've had one in my district as well that's had to cease operations. And it not only is it a dollars and cents, but it also is finding access to doctors in the profession as well as insurance as well. So I think we have to look at it when it comes to our rural hospitals, dollars as well as finding those folks that are willing to go practice in rural Iowa. We've had some initiatives that we've tried to put in the budget that would require more of these rural residencies when it comes to mental health and others. I think we need to be looking more at that to make sure that we're having the access we need in rural Iowa and all across the state to health care.
And I'd just add that we too stand ready to work with the governor to make sure that our providers are being paid more timely. I think it is a good sign, as Representative Grassley said, that the governor's staff has withheld $44 million from one of those care providers because they haven't yet been able to fulfill the terms of the contract. And if there are additional tools that she and her staff would like to have in their toolbox to help make sure providers are paid timely, we stand willing to help.
I want to chime in on this just really quickly because $2 million to these rural hospitals is a drop in the bucket. When you look at how much Iowa taxpayers pay for Medicaid moms, for labor and delivery and NICU visits, the amount of dollars we pay is probably somewhere between $110 and $160 million a year. So if you take 12% of that, that's what these MCOs get to cut off the top and take home and put in their pocket. And that is what is causing our rural hospitals to struggle because they're not paying enough for even to cover the cost of keeping a mom in the hospital after a normal delivery for 48 hours, which is standard of care in Iowa. They don't even fully cover the cost of drive-by delivery.
Since Charles just shut the mic off, I have to be able to respond to that. That was on you, Senator Schneider, not me. But I will tell you, for a legislator from Polk County to be lecturing someone from rural Iowa on the concerns that they're hearing when it comes to critical access hospitals and access to health care, I will tell you the $7.5 billion budget, that $2 million that we put into there was one of the most, I won't say celebrated, but was most appreciated with it. When I went back into my district, I heard more about that or as much as I did on a $7.5 billion budget. So to discount that, I think would discredit what I'm hearing back home. So I apologize you feel that way, but I'm speaking from Butler and Grundy, Hardin County. That is not what I'm hearing back home. So I apologize you feel that way, Senator Petersen.
Well, they can do the math in your district and look at the amount of money that is being shipped out of state and allowable profit to these MCOs.
Senator Schneider, will the Senate again be the graveyard for the governor's phone voting rights amendment?
That bill right now is in the Judiciary Committee and it's still alive. And I know the governor and her staff have been working with my colleagues in the Senate to try and find a way for that to get through that committee and through the Senate. And we'll let the bill take its course. We take seriously whatever the governor wants to propose and ask us to consider. Sometimes it just takes longer to work things through than others.
Does it put any additional pressure on you all to do something since Iowa now is kind of the outlier on that policy? Fairly on the state I think left.
We want to make sure that whatever gets done, if we're able to find a way to get it done, is done well and done in an intelligent fashion that doesn't have unintended consequences.
Will the Senate just let the House pass, have an
If you talk to Senator Zahn in the Judiciary Committee, he's probably the better person to ask because he's been more directly involved in conversations trying to work it through the committee. But I think what a lot of our senators have concerns about, or some anyway, is just, who exactly would be entitled to vote if the constitutional amendment is passed. Everyone has mentioned that there needs to be legislation to go with the constitutional amendment. We think those ought to run on parallel tracks and not at different times.
The governor mentioned that some of the exceptions that present in the employer liability language that was passed last year might be a starting point in terms of who would be exempted from accountability.
Say that again, sorry.
So there was legislation last year to protect employers that hire people with criminal records, and there's some exemptions in that bill. The governor said that those exemptions might be applicable to that.
Yeah, they could be. I can't speak for the Judiciary Committee. Again, this is a process, and there are 50 senators in our chamber, and we've got to try to work with all of them.
What do you make of the argument of voting rights advocates who say, if someone's completed their time, they're in society, they're paying taxes, this is an extension on what the criminal justice system is designed to do by withholding their vote?
Again, those are conversations that are being had in the Judiciary Committee. I don't know every single objection someone may have to them. I can't speak for everyone in my caucus. I'd like to find a way to get it done, and I know the governor would too. And we'll see what happens as the bill works its way through the Judiciary Committee.
Where's the House today? I let the bill pass, but I think there was some concerns about acting on additional legislation that.
And I think to Senator Schneider's comments, I know that there's still conversations going on between the committees, or at the committee level and at the leadership level as well on this issue between the House and Senate. I think that we've obviously displayed willingness to show the bill, but we want to continue to work to find where that common ground may be, not only with the Senate, but with the governor as well, and look forward to seeing what the Senate's able to get passed and sent back. And I think that there'd be an open ear with whatever that might be in the House, but I don't know what that is today, so it's hard for me to make that prediction. So.
Do you all agree with the purpose of second chances? I mean, is that, you disagree with the governor? I mean, do you agree with that premise?
From the House's perspective, I think we've already shown the willingness to pass one of the priorities that the governor put before us. So, but again, I know those conversations are still going on, again, not only at the leadership level, but I think more importantly at the committee level between the House and Senate, and as well as working with the governor's office to see what, obviously the bill has to receive the votes in each chamber and make it to the desk. So,
And I would add this to the conversation as a voting rights advocate. The House has acted. The bill's in the Senate. It needs to be made a priority. It needs to move out. And this is a big deal, particularly for someone who's paid their rights or paid their debts to society. This is how you bring back people into society and how you make them productive citizens again. And this goes, in my mind, it goes to reduce recidivism. The governor has a tool in her toolbox right now, and she has the executive order. She can use it. She can restore these rights. Past governors have done it. Iowa, in my mind, has a black eye on this issue. We're with the rest of the country, and it's time we catch up.
Representative, to your point on the executive order, the counter argument has been that might take the impetus off getting the constitutional amendment done, that may, make legislators less likely to act.
But then this hesitation is preventing people who, by right, should be able to vote from not having that right to vote. So, I mean, time is of the essence in some ways for people who are denied the vote.
I'd also like to add, if the governor does not sign an executive order, I fully expect the Secretary of State to be asking Iowa taxpayers to foot the bill to clean up a list that could put Iowa in jeopardy of another lawsuit on someone who's not able to vote because the Secretary of State does not have clean records.
What is the plan in the House in regards to the governor's priority issue of letting women obtain small farms?
well, I think we continue to have that conversation with the governor's office. And from my perspective, I made it very clear that I want the committee process to work. And I know within Representative Lundgren, Representative Meyer, others are having those conversations right now. And again, as we move forward, I think it'll be part of the dialogue within our caucus.
Last year, bills to create a voucher system or education aid to accounts did in advance, neither chamber. Do you see that as something that has a chance in legislative session, or is that pretty much off the table?
I don't know where that will stand. The composition in the chambers hasn't changed, so I'm not sure that it would have any more likelihood of succeeding this year than it did last.
I echo what Senator Schneider said.
Is there room budget for a tax cut this year and something for this?
Is there, did you say if there's room in the budget? Well, I think from the House's perspective, if we have the opportunity to return dollars to Iowans, hardworking Iowans, I think we're going to do that if the opportunity arises. But what I can tell you is, as I sit here today, we passed a significant tax cut. Whatever decision we do make, we want to make sure it does not jeopardize that moving forward, and that the tax cut that we've passed is fully implemented. So if the opportunity arises and there's room to do that, we'll definitely be entertaining that. But as I sit here right now, that is the priority, to make sure what we've passed is implemented.
I said governor's budget, on the budget hearing, some business lobbyists suggested that the trigger be set up for that tax bill. Is that something that you would consider?
We're on track to meet the revenue trigger. I think the only trigger remaining that we'd look at is the 4% growth trigger. That's something we're willing to work to look at and explore. We're always looking for ways to return dollars to taxpayers and to make Iowa more competitive. And the fact remains, our tax climate right now is still uncompetitive. We rank in the 40s according to the Tax Foundation, and that's not good enough for a state like Iowa. We need to do better.
Is that for individuals or businesses? What would you say?
So their metric looks at individual and corporate income taxes. It looks at sales tax, and it looks at property tax.
I would chime in, from our perspective in the minority on the tax issue. The tax package that was passed, I think in 2018, it's not fully implemented yet. It was a phase-in package with triggers, and I tend to agree with what Speaker Grassley is saying about we're not through this process yet of phasing in. The other thing I would say is, in many ways, the state is not meeting its obligations. I mean, we talked about health care just a few minutes ago, and how we are failing to meet obligations with health care, supporting critical access hospitals across the state, and as well as mental health. We still have not funded the recently created juvenile children's mental health program. And so if we're going to talk about taxes, we have to talk about the budget, and we have to talk about the obligations of the state, not to mention making sure that Iowa leads the nation in education, which we don't anymore. The other thing I'll say, besides meeting the state's obligations, is what I've seen in my community has not really been so much a tax deduction, but a tax burden shift. And you look at what's happening with property taxes, particularly across the state, but in rural areas like mine, property taxes are really bearing the brunt of the state's inability to fund programs like education, fund the local hospitals and things like that. And that was the solution to the funding shortfall in Floyd County, was to give what was a hospital without taxing authority now has taxing authority. And it's a burden shift. And so we can call it a tax cut, but let's look at what it really is. A lot of times it's been a burden shift. It's been a burden shift to people that can't afford a much higher burden.
For the Democrats, what would you like to see in medical cannabis expansion this session? And for the Republicans, I'm more interested on the procedural side of things, because last year a bill was sent to the governor that she ultimately rejected. So process-wise, and if you want to add in what you'd like to see, feel free, but I'm also curious about the process this session and ensuring that if a bill does go to the governor this time, that it's one that she'll be ready to put her name on.
I would like to see the bill that passed the House go back I think that was a good bill. It got levels for the levels where for what we were told and what we understood where they need to be, where they can do good for people who are suffering from certain ailments. So in my mind, I think we sent a good bill down. I'd like to see
But the governor vetoed that. Is that
Well,
what you really want to say?
I think that was a mistake.
From my perspective, obviously, the House, the Senate, the board, and the governor have to work on a bill that we can not only pass in each chamber, but something that the governor can obviously sign. So as I sit here, I'm not going to get into what the weeds would be of that specific issue because we have experts in all of our caucuses that'll be working on those things. But I think from my perspective, leading the caucus, that's my expectation of each side as well as working with the governor and the board.
Obviously, I supported the bill that we passed last year. I voted in favor of it. I have been a strong supporter of medical cannabis since I came into the legislature, and I'd like to find a way to send something to the governor that she would be willing to sign and something over to the House that they would be willing to pass as well. So it's a matter of us working together and finding a way to get something done for Iowans that makes dosing more practical for patients and for the producers, something that potentially expands conditions if that's something we can find agreement on, and something that just works better for Iowans.
Was there a lack of communication last year on what the governor would be willing to sign, or was there just misunderstanding, or what happened there?
I wouldn't say there was a lack of communication. The House sent us a bill, and if you recall, the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board had some issues with it, and I think that kind of threw things into flux. So, that's another constituency I think that we need to engage in order to pass a bill through both chambers and to send something down to the governor that she's willing to sign.
Is there at all any concern about the future of the program, given that across the border in Illinois, recreational marijuana is legal, so people in Eastern Iowa could conceivably go over there and get what they think they're not getting here?
I don't think any decisions, especially on this issue, that are made, we're going to be doing anything similar to or based off of what the state of Illinois has been doing with their track record on so many things. I think we need to do what's best for Iowans, like Senator Schneider said, and make sure that we have a program that's working here. So from my perspective, and I think what you're going to see from the legislature, is we should not be basing many decisions that we do based on anything Illinois may or may not be doing.
But is there a sense of urgency on this? I mean, when you get into session, are you going to pass it quickly, get it to the governor, and make it effective immediately? Because there's some concern that with the competition from Illinois, the makers in Iowa aren't going to be able to survive. I know there's some lawmakers who say it's not my job to make sure somebody can stay in business, but to a certain degree it is.
I'm not going to make any predictions on the timeline, but if that becomes a relevant issue that all groups working on the issue can find a reason to speed up the process, if that's relevant, I think that that's definitely a possibility. But I think making sure that we pass a bill that's a good bill that works for Iowans is going to be the priority. And if that's a part of, if the timeliness is part of it, then obviously we'll have to take that into consideration.
The governor mentioned that there's a whole range of levels that could be written into a new bill, but what was her explanation for not accepting the level in the previous bill in your discussions with her?
I'm not going to speak on by any means for what the governor's rationale would have been. What I can tell you from my perspective, as far as what we need to be doing on the legislative side, is all groups need to be working. I don't mean working that we have not been working together on this in the past, but that is the emphasis on us developing what this policy is, and that includes the board as well. So as far as her rationale, I'm not going to speak from that matter.
Hearing Republican leaders talk about the childcare assistance cliff, concerns about that. I heard estimates that it could be, up to $20 million to really take care of that. How much will is there among House and Senate Republicans to really put up that kind of money to build that?
Go, I don't want to keep talking. I can't help myself. It's in the House room. This is where the appropriations met. I get to talk all the time. But from the standpoint of this problem wasn't just created overnight, and we recognize it's going to take time. And I think as we're having these conversations, we know that when we start down this path, it's going to have to be a commitment, because I don't know as I sit here today whether it's realistic to wipe everything out in 1 year, but I also know if we don't start down the path of trying to do that, we're just going to continue to talk about it as an issue and never try to address it. So how it is implemented and phased in, that's what I said earlier as far as what it looks like. I don't think it's been settled at this point, but I think the fact that it's being recognized by all parties as an issue is a very positive step forward when trying to address the Cliff Effect.
And I'd agree with that. This could be a multi-year effort. I don't know what the estimate would be for doing it in 1 year, but it's something that I do think we need to address. I think it's something that's important. People on both sides of the aisle recognize the issue, and I'd like to find a way for all of us to come together to get something done.
I want to make sure I understand the scope of what you're talking about when you talk about childcare. Obviously, there's the conversation over the cliff, but the Register wrote extensively in 2019 about issues with the quality of care that families have when it comes to child care in terms of oversight, in terms of deaths, very serious problems. Where does that conversation lie in this whole picture about child care and addressing that during the legislative session?
Well, I could say from the standpoint as far as quality of care, I don't know if I can give you a specific answer right now, Barbara, as far as what that piece looks like, but what I can tell you, we are having conversations in our caucus about quality of care, and some of that is as far as whether it's educational training, some of the programs that we've done that we've all supported that have been bipartisan support, and I think are good legislation. For example, issues like childcare did not rise to the level of, as far as one of them that you could receive assistance. So I think we need to be looking at what are some of the programs that we currently have where we can provide assistance to folks to not only get into the field but receive the proper education that they need and training that they need to do that. So I think the conversation is fairly broad as far as the specifics of that. I don't think I can answer that right now, but we are having a conversation how we can make sure that it's not just about dollars and cents, and that's what we've talked about in our caucus. It's not just the money, it's also about the quality and access as well of the care.
So before I was elected, I was actually serving on the board of our child care facility in Charles City. It's called the TLC, the Learning Center, and community child care center. And there's a lot of issues when you talk child care. I mean, I think the quality of care, you can kind of stovepipe that issue, which the Register covered with, kind of the investigations and, who's qualified and what are the standards that we're enforcing for child care. And a lot of that falls then on the Department of Human Services to administer those programs. And then you look at that department and what's happened and how it's lost a lot of employees. It's lost a lot of investigators and people that perform oversight and protective services. And so there is an issue there. And to me, that issue deals with supporting the Department of Human Services and doing those things, consumer and child safety, that Iowans expect their government to do to safeguard the public. The other issue then, kind of putting on my old board member hat, is it's twofold. A lot of communities like Charles City and around the state have infrastructure issues. They need to find a suitable facility that works to have a child care in it. So then, in my mind, then we're talking about grant programs, we're talking about kind of capital improvement type programs. The other end of this, though, is that, we talk about this in a workforce capacity, as a workforce development issue. Well, for a lot of families, the cost of health care doesn't meet the cost that they make hourly wage, right? If they have 2 or 3 children in health care, they're not making enough per hour. Child care. They're not making enough per hour to really make it worthwhile having that job if they're not meeting those costs. And so, we would look at things as on the Democratic side as child care tax credits for working families to make child care affordable and to give ramps for people to get into the workforce, as well as just the supports for the overcost to help child care centers keep their costs down. And we've got food programs, we've got all sorts of programs that are administered that work that we need to make sure are accessible and available.
I'd chime in just first off, thank you to the Des Moines Register for covering the issue. And we have seen a number of Iowa children die in child care settings, and that's shameful for our state. We do a better job of inspecting restaurants in our state than we do in inspecting child care facilities, and we need to take a strong look at that to see what we can do to better protect Iowa's children.
Your state aid number last year was 2.1%, and that was in a tight budget. You've got a $289 million surplus. Do you think you can do at least 2.1, if not a higher number this go around for schools?
Rod, you know that I've been here long enough not to commit to a number as I sit here a week before session starts. But what I can tell you is, we've made $860 million worth of investments in education. It's obviously going to be a priority. Not only the dollars, but as well as the timeliness of it. We hear from our school districts that we need to move quickly, and we've recognized that. Also, another issue that I think that we've brought to the forefront and we've begun down the path trying to address, which would be the equity piece as well as the transportation costs. We passed that last year. So whenever I have those conversations back home in my school districts, that's always brought up as far as some additional things that we've done. Also with categoricals, making sure that we open those up so schools can use those in a flexible manner. So as far as to sit here right now and commit to a number, you know me well enough to know that I'm not going to do that. What I can tell you is we've made education a priority, and we will continue to do so.
Are you willing to put a number on it?
I'm not going to put a number on it. I'll give you this number, though, $265 million. That's the amount of new money we've put into K-12 education over the last 3 years. I'll give you another number 2. That's where we rank in terms of the states that have put new money into K-12 education since the recession in 2007, 2008. Here's another number 2 for you. We're number 2 when it comes to concurrent enrollment. We're number 1 when it comes to public school graduation rate. We're number 1 in average ACT scores. So we're doing a lot of things well in education. I think we've shown with our budget that it's a priority of ours. For some people, we'll never spend enough money, but we've got a limited amount of dollars that we can work with, and we think that we're appropriating a good amount of money toward K-12 education, especially when you look at how we rank compared to other states. And we always want to do better in education. I don't think we should ever be satisfied with where we are. And we ought to look at not just other states and how we compete, but we ought to look around the globe to see how other countries are doing to make sure that we're preparing our kids for global competition in the workforce.
Let's put those numbers in context. We're not keeping up with inflation with the numbers that have just been cited. When you're not keeping up with inflation, you're seeing things like bigger class sizes. You're seeing things like closed buildings, consolidation of school districts, which is continuing to happen at a rapid pace. And so, we can talk about new money, but let's keep it in context. When we're not keeping up with inflation, when we're not meeting the needs of our school districts across the state, and you're seeing things like Iowa's, rankings slip to where we're, I think, 26th in the nation now in our public education system, where a generation ago we were in the top 3, and let's keep this in context.
Okay, then what do those rankings represent? What do you think? 26.
I think some of the numbers I've seen, I apologize not having it, but I remember seeing a statistic. Some of Iowa's performances were somewhere in the middle of the pack compared to the nation, compared to other states. So I don't want to oversight that statistic, but my point is that we used to be a leader. We have ceded that ground, and we're not keeping up. And when you don't keep up with inflation, you don't keep up with the things that are needed to educate the workforce of tomorrow, you're going to see that type of slippage.
Republicans a few years ago had oversight hearings regarding a residential school in southeast Iowa that was accused of abusing residents. Will you have oversight hearings about Glenwood?
I think where we're at this point, obviously with the federal government being involved, with our DHS here at the state level, still doing their investigations. I personally have met with the director, recognize the severity of the situation, but I think for us to sit here and just start having meetings before we've even reached the bottom of what's going on with that situation would be a little bit premature. What I'll tell you is my expectation is our human resources committees, as well as our leadership, would be in constant conversation with the department to make sure that as information breaks or as we need to be brought in the loop, and if there's actions that we need to take, we are taking them. That's what my expectation is as I sit here before the investigations I think have been concluded, or more information would be prepared to be given to us at this point.
That wasn't the chain of events for the school and something.
At this point in time, we're going to be consistent with, I'm going to use a consistent statement that I just used, Kay, and that's my expectation from how we're going to move forward in the House. Again, like I said earlier, I have full confidence. I was very impressed with the new director, and made it very clear to her that the House expects to be kept very well in the loop, and making sure that whatever we can do to be helpful and whatever we need to be doing, we recognize how severe this issue is, and whatever we need to be doing, we need to get there.
I'd echo what Representative Grassley said. It's the things that we've been reading about are disturbing. It seems like the governor and the new DHS director, Kelly Garcia, are doing a good job of responding right now. We'll see what their report shows and take action from there.
I just chime in that Senate Democrats requested an investigation last year. We had an amendment ready to go. Once again, this was on a bill where no amendments were allowed to be debated. I don't know what the point of having a Government Oversight Committee is if the committee is not willing to meet. We had requested that committee take a look at all DHS facilities, as we've seen a number of alarming issues, not just from Glenwood, but from Woodward. We had trouble with the juvenile home for girls. We have yet to see what's been done in Eldora. So the Government Oversight Committee is probably one of the most important committees, and it is upsetting that leadership has not allowed that committee to meet.
I think anybody who reads the reports that are coming out of Glenwood are shocked. I mean, it's kind of appalling what we're seeing is happening there, and I think we can't be afraid to investigate just because we may not like what we find. This is a very serious situation. If it means that we need to look at the staffing and the funding for Glenwood as something that impacts our budget, and we need to make budget considerations and decisions in terms of how we support this facility going forward and others like it. We need to ask those hard questions and not be afraid of what we might find.
I would add one thing. Senator Petersen brings up a point. From the House's perspective, last session, we made a request of the former director because we were hearing, I think, similar things to what you guys are commenting on right now. We were hearing similar things. We made a request to find out if there were more resources needed, what investigation needed to be done. We were told that there was not a problem. So for us to make a decision that we were told by the department was not the case, obviously didn't happen. And I don't want anyone to think that any of the comments that Senator Schneider and I have made today don't think that the House and the Senate's not prepared to act as well as the governor. It's just as I sit here right now, I don't know what those actions may or may not look like.
Well, I'm the mom of teenage kids, and I can tell you, very simple rule, trust but verify. And that should be the same. That's why we have checks and balances in government, and they should be used.
And to follow up on that, Representative Grassley, isn't that, if I understand what you're saying right, isn't that kind of an argument for holding a government oversight meeting if you were told last year that nothing was wrong and obviously something was?
As I sit here, it doesn't mean there won't be a meeting. All I'm saying is for me just to say that there's a meeting set today here before we have more information, I think is, I don't think we're at that point yet as far as from the House's perspective.
You mentioned that you expect that the House will be kept very much in the loop about developments with the, I assume, state inquiry and maybe the federal investigation. What can the public expect to learn from the legislature or what the legislature puts on DHS in terms of a report? And whatever that timeline is, can the public expect to learn the scope of what happened or hasn't happened, or just the dynamics of what is going on potentially at Glenwood?
I think that should be our expectation. I mean, what can be shared? I mean, I'm not a lawyer as far as what can and cannot be shared as far as intimate level of detail, but with what can be, I think that should be our expectation as a legislature.
Right, but does that mean, taking action during the legislative session that requires a report that's going to be made public?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think, again, been here long enough not to just sit and make predictions, but I would be surprised if the legislature does not take some level of action. I'm just not going to make any predictions on what that may or may not be at this point.
In your meeting with Director Garcia, did she say anything about, any sort of funding requests? Because I think last year they had requested an increase with those two facilities that are being investigated. Is that changing?
At this point, I have not been made aware, and I won't speak from the appropriations chair if he's been made aware of any. I have not been made aware of any increases, but again, I think that this has been a situation where it's been kind of a rapid response, trying to figure out the scope of what's actually going on here. I don't know, and I won't speak for the governor, so I'm going to be probably more vague than what you want me to be, but I don't know from the dollars and cents perspective, but I think the legislature, as we're developing the budget, should be prepared that that's a part of it, even if it's not in the governor's original budget.
So, Representative Grassley, you mentioned shortly after becoming Speaker selected, you were hoping to work with consensus in your caucus. About a dozen members of your caucus were strongly opposed to the solar bill the American Energy was pushing last session. Would you say that that's off the table, or are you going to be pushing it that bill to pass?
I have, at this point, as I sit here, I've had nobody bring that issue to me in any of the meetings that I've had leading up to session. So at this point, I would say nothing's probably changed since we left last session as far as where our caucus would be.
Is another conversion therapy ban on the table for this session? Or rumors that Republicans are taking that up?
Well, I think that as we sit here a week before session starts, there's probably a lot of bills that are being drafted and filed. I have not had a conversation with any of our members specifically on that one. I've probably heard similar things to what everybody else has heard, but I've not had any specific conversations.
Is that something you'd be open to?
If our caucus my approach is going to be if our caucus wants to have a conversation about something, as the leader of the caucus, I don't think it's my job to tell them what they should and should not be allowed to talk about. And but I also am not going to sit here making predictions on what the result of that meeting may be.
What about inside?
I expect we'll probably see a bill on conversion therapy. It's something I'm open to exploring. Again, like any other bill, it'll have to work its way through the process.
Well, this is part of the game.
I'm open to it, certainly. Different states have done it in different ways. So I think how the bill is phrased and what it does certainly will have an impact on how much support it can get.
Senator, you were seeking at the end of the session to have a conversation about raising the age for purchasing back to 21. Now that that's federal law, do you see any action in regards to trying to stop the aging at schools?
We haven't had a conversation as a caucus about where to go with that now that the federal government has taken action, and I haven't really had a whole lot of time to reflect on that myself personally. So I still want to understand more fully what the federal action means and whether or not it makes sense to do anything more at the state level.
There was a release of data just a few weeks ago about Iowa's state-run family planning program. The fact that the number of people enrolled in the program continues to drop in such a way that doesn't add up with the fact that there may be some people who are turning to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, for coverage, given that people qualify for the family planning program and may not qualify for some services elsewhere. So there's a concern from advocates that people are falling through the cracks as it pertains to family planning. I'm curious what the Republican leadership thinks about that, given that there was essentially, maybe promise is too much of a strong word, but a guarantee from Republicans that that the switch to a state family planning program that excludes abortion providers would not impact family planning services for Iowans.
Well, I'd like to see everyone who wants access to it be able to get it easily. So if there are changes we need to make, and I don't know what those would be, but I'm certainly open to finding ways to make it more accessible for people who are having issues getting access.
And I don't know what data you're specifically talking about, Barbara, but the data that I've seen, there was already that trend in that direction before, and maybe that's the one that you're speaking of, but there was already that trend toward where we are today, starting well before we created the state run program.
Right, it's a steeper decline, and I'm referencing data that DHS released in early December.
Okay. I don't know if that's the same one that I saw, so I probably shouldn't say anymore. It looks stupid if I don't
But
know.
if there is more information that continues to come out that indicates that maybe there might be people falling through the cracks, is there an openness from the House to take some type of legislative action as it relates to family planning in the state?
If there are folks that are falling through the cracks that do not have access to the services, I think that our caucus would be willing to look at what we need to do to make the program work so people no longer fall through the cracks. But again, I cannot tell you what those are at this point, or why or why not they would be falling through the cracks.
Senator Schneider, according to a form Secretary Petersen made available a couple of days ago, effective with the 2020 legislative session in Iowa, the Senate is no longer conventional media, rather you are accepting applications for the senators in the workspace. Can you describe the thought process about why change that policy and what criteria will be used to determine who receives workspace in the Senate chamber and who is moved to the overflow area in the process?
I wasn't involved in any of those conversations, so you'd have to ask Majority Leader Whitfer about that, or Charlie Smithson.
So are you aware of anyone recommending any changes and how the Senate handled those issues last session?
Aside from the emails you sent me,
Yes, aside from the emails that I were you aware of it?
I haven't received any comments, emails, voicemails, any kind of communication from anyone other than yourself. There's that nonprofit group that I think and I can't remember the name, they sent a letter, but I don't remember the details of it, so. But aside from aside from journalists themselves, I've not heard from anyone, other than yourself.
Is there any agreement between the Senate and House Republicans on how mental health funding should be approached this session? What the tax overruns for it, or has anything worked out?
I think we all recognize that we need to put some money into mental health funding, and the bills that we passed over the last couple of years for adult mental health and children's mental health will require us to provide more funding for mental health services. So I would expect to see us do something on that, and I believe we'll probably see the governor recommend something for us to do in her condition of the state address next week.
Yeah, I would similar comment to what Senator Schneider made as far as any current agreement that exists, no, other than we recognize that it's an issue that's going to have to be addressed.
I'd also just chime in that we've got more than 10,000 Iowans on the health and home and community-based waivers. And there are a lot of Iowans that are concerned as we begin to look for funding for the children's mental health services, that dollars aren't stripped away from the adult services that are clearly not fully funded. When you have more than 10,000 Iowans on a waiting list, we're going to need to find a different and sustainable revenue source.
You talked about funding sources and earlier taxes. Is I will part of that discussion?
We almost made it.
Come on.
I opened my mouth. I pray now they're going to look at me to say something. Here, we actually, when we had our most recent caucus, as far as the House's perspective, I would just give you on the issue of Iowa, I'll just answer it with that if you're comfortable, if you're okay with me doing that. So here's what I can tell you. If something were to move forward, and just by me talking about it, people are gonna say, well then, obviously it has a momentum. I tell everyone, don't read into any comment I'm sharing with you other than information. That there will need to be a change to the formula that's currently exists if our caucus were to support that. I walked away from that. The other thing I walked away from caucus with knowing is that this is going to take a while to get done. And then now you're going to follow up and say how long? I don't know, but I can tell you that it is not. There's some that I'm hearing that are telling us this thing's ready to go. And I would say to anyone that has that feeling, we are a long ways from that point. How long? I don't know, but I can tell you there's a lot of unanswered questions. And part of that would be with what you just touched on. Not only the 3/8, but what do you do with the 5/8? How do you spend that? How do you change the formula? I mean, there's so many moving parts on this. I just tell everyone this is not going to be something that's just, even if there is a will within the legislature to do something, it isn't something that just happens overnight.
When you raised the gas tax, it was important to leadership that that be a bipartisan vote. Do you feel that with I will or any action on sales tax, do you think it would be important to have some kind of bipartisan support, or is that something you're prepared to do with 52 or 53 votes in the House the way the 2018 tax passed?
After our caucus, what was that, 2 weeks ago, or whenever we had it, there's so many moving parts at this point, I can't even make a prediction on if there would be, how many votes we'd even have within our own caucus, let alone, and I won't speak for Representative Pritchard, what they may or may not have in our caucus. I can just tell you that there are so many moving parts, I don't think any of us probably can sit here and answer, this is how many votes we may or may not be able to put together, or how many the other side would be able to do as well. So, again, I'm just telling everyone that there's a lot of unanswered questions.
I think the question is, whatever you put together, does it have to be something that has both Republican and Democrat support before you would advance it, or would you be willing to advance something that's 53-47 and 30?
Well, I think when you get to an issue like this that I think that's been talked about for the last 10 years, I'd be surprised if it didn't just naturally have support from both sides, regardless of who was in charge or who wasn't. But as far as setting what a certain criteria may or may not look like, I think that's premature for me to make that prediction, Aaron.
I think from the Democratic perspective, we obviously see the need. We're open to the discussion, but as the old saying goes, the devil's in the details. And we've got Representative Grassley, Speaker-elect Grassley, talking about the formula and things like that. I mean, those are important details. And then this gets into bigger conversation of just making sure that our tax system is fair and it works for all Iowans. So. We haven't had that discussion. We haven't been at the table. It hasn't been. I haven't participated in any of those types of discussions. But we're open for the conversation. If we're going to talk about improving water quality and land use and the natural environment for the state of Iowa, then we're at the table. That's a high priority for Democrats, obviously.
And from the Senate Republican side, I'd say we're open to it. We just want to make sure that whatever happens is a net tax decrease for Iowans.
I have a question for Republican leadership. It's an election year, and there's a lot of chatter as always about the dynamics of who controls the legislature and the possibility that Democrats might reclaim the House in 2020. Are there issues that you see as the like a very, very top priority that you want to try to accomplish this session, given the possibility that the Republicans lose some power in the next election?
Here's what I can say as far as looking forward into the next election. I can tell you from the House Republicans' perspective, what we don't want to see is that the House operates like the House does at the federal level, not able to get anything done. So to answer your question, I don't think the decisions that we make or the things that we do in a legislature are going to be based on keeping control. What we're going to prove to Iowans and show to Iowans is that we've heard their concerns, unlike the federal government, and the House is doing nothing. We are going to address the concerns that we're hearing from Iowans. And again, workforce, childcare, broadband, housing, all of those issues. I think our goal needs to be to show the state that this isn't about just doing something to get votes. This is showing that we can run the state and listen to their concerns and try to address what they are, because it's happening in all of our districts. The issues I just touched on are existing in almost all of our districts. And so I think that's what you're going to see, not decisions based on who may or may not keep the majority, but showing that we have the ability to get things done and address the concerns that we're hearing.
From our standpoint, we didn't get elected to worry about being reelected. We got elected because we wanted to move Iowa forward in a positive direction. There are always priorities that we need to be working on. We've talked about several of them during this conference, but workforce and tax policy are big ones that I personally would like to see us get done this year.
I mean, still though, does the election even impact the timetable for wanting to? Obviously, lawmakers always want to pass the budget and get out as quickly as possible, but is there an extra pressure given the 2020 election?
The last election cycle, I'll just remind you, we passed significant income tax relief. We passed the largest income tax relief bill that we've ever seen in our state, and we went beyond the 100 reimbursable or per diem days for legislative session. We don't care how long it takes. What we do care about is good policy and getting it right.
Also, at the end of the 2018 session, you passed significant abortion-related legislation. Is there any major, I guess, social conservative policy that you anticipate trying to get through ahead of the 2020 election?
Well, I think, oh, go ahead, Charles, if you want to go.
I was just going to say, I expect there will be legislation filed. Again, it'll have to work its way through the process, and we'll see what happens with anything that's filed.
I think that we've shown that that our caucuses are very strong on some of the issues that I'm sure you're referring to. And so, like Senator Schneider said, those are going to be part of the conversations that we have within each of our chambers. And if there's the support there within each to do those, we'll obviously move forward. Back to your question, and not to cut you off, so follow up, but as I was thinking about your question, Barbara, from my perspective, the premise of the question is what I would have more of the problem with from the standpoint of I fully expect Republicans to be in control as we sit here a year from now. So I don't think that from my perspective I'm approaching this session with the mentality that maybe you are while asking the question.
I mean, it's Democrats. Whoever the minority party is will always kind of say this is going to be our year, so I'm just showcasing what other people are saying.
I understand. I'm just showcasing what my mentality I'm using going into this session.
I think we'll wrap up on something else once again before the end, but thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Highest elderly population.